IVM.
Welcome to All Things Policy, a daily podcast by the Takshashila Institution. We are a bunch of policy nerds based in Bengaluru, and we like bringing fresh perspectives to Indian affairs and Indian perspectives to global affairs. So grab a cup of coffee, sit back, and join us for today's chat.
Hello and welcome to today's episode of All Things Policy. Today we're going to discuss some of the big reforms that were undertaken in the agricultural sector. So after the pandemic hit India and we went into months of lockdown, etc., part of unlocking was a set of measures which were announced by the finance minister and other ministries of the government. And there were 4 consecutive days of press conferences where different kind of reforms were announced, different packages were announced, relief packages, etc. What we're going to be focusing on is probably 3 of the biggest reforms that has immense potential to make real change in the agricultural sector. And it's also important to remember the context in which these reforms slot themselves in. Agricultural sector has actually not been reformed since ever, really. In 1991, there was a lot of hope that along with the other vast changes that were made in terms of liberalization, privatization, and inching towards globalization, that the agricultural sector as well would be reformed. But unfortunately, there were very little of changes that one could see in this particular sector, even though we made changes to the product market, where a lot of people got freedom to buy and sell any particular products and commodities that they wanted. Agriculture was not touched. It was thought of as to be too holy to be touched, and therefore, there was too much emotions riding in about farmers and agriculture, etc. So, in the garb of protecting farmers, I think we have done them immense injustice over the years, and we've seen throughout how this has led to one agricultural crisis after the other, farmers' suicide, etc. So, to discuss all of this, I have with me Sarthak Pradhan, who's a fellow economist at the Takshashila Institution. Welcome, Sarthak.
Hi, Anupam.
Yeah. So that was a long prelude before we got started, but I thought it was just important to set the context because agriculture, we've never really reformed the agriculture sector, have we?
So, yes, Anupam. So the finance minister had announced some reforms, and in the subsequent months, there were some ordinances. And these ordinances pertain to primarily 3 things. One is how they are permitting trade outside the physical boundaries as defined by the APMCs, the Agriculture Produce Marketing or Market Committees. And also the reforms facilitate contract farming, and they ease restrictions on the Essential Commodities Act. What we'll do is we'll look at each of these things and why they were essential and how they can change the course in future. So first thing, there was an ordinance, the Farmers Produce Trade, Commerce, Promotion and Facilitation Ordinance. Now, this ordinance is trying to ensure that the farmers are able to sell their produce outside the jurisdiction set by the Agriculture Produce Marketing Committees. Now, how do farmers sell their produce in India? In fact, in most of the parts of the country. So as per the laws, farming, agriculture is in the state list. So different states will have their own laws. And according to these laws, APMCs are set up, Agriculture Produce Marketing Committees. And APMCs are there for a specific jurisdiction. They can be for a block, they can be for a district. And all those farmers who are in that block or in that district have to sell their produce in the market yards which are defined by APMCs. So that means they cannot sell their produce in open markets. And in these market yards, the traders, whoever are there, they have to get a license. And these APMCs are supposed to provide different kind of facilities like weighing facilities, drying facilities, and all these things. And for that, they charge some fees. So if you are selling outside the market yard, it might be even considered as criminal activities in some states. So as a result of all these things, what has happened is there is no competition among the traders. In some cases, within the traders, they have formed cartels among themselves. So they keep the prices artificially low. As a result of which, the farmers, they don't get the right prices, and the consumers, they have to pay a higher price. In between, the traders, they make money. And sometimes, these intermediaries can play an important role, but here they are not doing much. They have the role only because the food processors or the restaurants who would have used the products, they cannot directly procure it from the farmers. So since you have put the restrictions on them, these guys, they are the ones who are actually running the show.
That seems a ridiculous thing, right? Imagine the only way that the true ridiculousness of this particular set of laws is to imagine how the same thing would apply in other places, and then it suddenly, becomes apparent to how ridiculous it is. So, for instance, imagine if you were told, Sarthak, as an economist, that you can sell your labor only in the area in which you live in, which is, let's say, Depinagar. And you can't actually sell anywhere else. Or let's say, you can't get out of your state and you'll have to sell your labor only in the state and not really go for the right opportunity anywhere else. Or let's say you were mandated that you could buy tomatoes only from a particular, within a particular area. You can't go outside and buy. So, if you just try and apply the same set of laws anywhere else, it as I said, it becomes kind of apparent as to how nonsensical it all is. And again, you can always argue that it was done out of good intentions and blah, blah, blah. But obviously, what it ended up doing was hurting the very people that were, supposed to protect. And you can readily imagine how, even as you said, what would happen is that there would be a collusion between traders and the elected representatives for the local marketing boards, and all put together would create the worst environment for farmers to sell their produce, right? And what would happen is that the mandis would collect the fees on the sale of the produce. So it was supposed to be done by the purchaser, but this happens in some kind of backward shifting, and essentially that price would actually be put on the farmers themselves, right? The farmers would bear that cost as well. So the farmers would in fact get a much lower price than what they would have gotten if without any of these laws. Finally, I think that's the context in which this particular act comes in. Now you can imagine that farmers have been suddenly given this freedom to sell their produce essentially anywhere, to anybody, and at any time of their choice. Now, these are three very, very important things. Anywhere would mean that it's not just, outside the jurisdiction of that particular APMC. They can sell anywhere within the state. And now, crucially, they can also sell in other states as well. And that is also a very important thing. So finally, you can, kind of think about barrier-free trade outside of the state boundaries for agricultural produce. So that is one very crucial thing. Now, anybody...
And one thing they have done is they have also allowed private parties to set up online trading platforms for trading different agricultural commodities. That means both intrastate as well as interstate trade in agricultural commodities can happen.
Exactly. And that's the anybody aspect of it. Now, essentially, the APMCs are government-mandated monopolies, correct? That's the way to think about the APMCs. They were actually monopsonies, which is that they had a monopoly in buying power, not really selling power, but buying power. And now, finally, anybody can enter this game. If you are an aggregator, for example, and you can now readily imagine that there is a very crucial part to play of aggregator. They can buy from multiple sources and then sell it to, let's say, one particular big company, let's say in the food processing and so on. So I think that entire game will change also because of this. Crucially, it's also at any time. So this, and you have to see this along with the other two aspects as well, especially the Essential Commodities Act. But a lot of the laws in India would, not permit or disallow hoarding, which is basically, a terrible word for warehousing, right? So now you can actually, wait for the prices to go up. Essentially, you don't have to sell all, your produce at the same time. You can wait for some time, wait for prices to be right, especially if it is non-perishable, and then sell it. So that, again, is a massive thing. So what you've done with this one single act is given immense freedom for farmers to sell their produce at a price they think is reasonable. Now, there were a lot of these laws which the government would say, this has to be a fair and reasonable price, without really at any point defining what a fair price is or what a reasonable price is. And of course, we know that governments are terrible. They cannot at any point, define these things. So the best way is to give the farmers the freedom to decide what is fair according to them, what is reasonable for them, and then sell accordingly.
Yeah, what is also interesting is, in the past, what has happened is the governments have come up with model APMC laws. They were trying to reform APMCs, but this law has changed the dynamics. What they have done is they have created competition for APMCs. So you are setting up trade areas. You are not saying that we are dismantling APMCs. So indirectly, what will happen is APMCs have to provide some service, which probably the trade areas that are being set up where you can freely enter into these transactions. If the APMCs are providing services which is beyond and above this, then they will survive or they will not. So there was a lot of reluctance in the past when you were trying to model APMCs. Now this dynamic can possibly change.
Yeah. Now, essentially, what you're telling me then is that not only is there going to be competition between different APMCs, so let's say APMC in Bangalore rural, one particular, let's say Tumkur, and the APMC in the neighboring district. But also that now the APMCs will compete with, let's say, as you said, e-trading platforms.
Exactly. Right? Trade areas. They're calling it as trade areas.
Trade areas. So that I think will be really important. So now the APMCs and the trade areas, etc., will have to provide good prices. So that's the standard price competition aspect of it. But apart from that, it will also have to compete on quality of service. So, the things that you were talking about, weighing, etc., or even helping in transportation, for example, all of these things, I think then will improve the quality of service to the farmers.
Exactly. But yeah, one thing, see, right now anyone can enter and anyone can be a trader here. So only you need the PAN card and you have to make the payments within 1 day or maximum 3 days. But government has the right to prescribe a system of registration for traders right now. So as per the ordinance, those kind of things are there, and it can also frame the rules for registration, code of conduct, procedure. So at present, it looks like this. We don't know how things will exactly pan out over a period of time. Maybe it will not be as unregulated as we are thinking right now.
Yeah. So this is, again, I think that is something we have to keep in mind. While we have been praising the model that has been shown in this act, we don't know how exactly it will play out. For example, even the ordinance, for instance, is not as clear as one would have hoped for in terms of how will it, actually pan out. And again, this is still an ordinance, right? It has to be passed into a law, which and that will have the details that one would want to see. So yes, there is lacunas in those things. And again, for me, the saddest aspect of all of this, just immediately to, put a pessimistic spin on it, is, as you correctly mentioned, Sarthak, many state governments have in the past tried to, reform the APMC. The union government itself has said a couple of times that we're going to do it. They've put in draft laws. They've, in fact, done some of these things before, and none of them have actually worked. Probably it's too strong lobby of the APMC. We don't know really the political economy that has stopped it from working. The only hope is because of the particular circumstances that we find ourselves in, which is the pandemic, etc., that this time will be successful, and that the government will have the political will to see through and push it.
Exactly. Apart from this ordinance, there was another ordinance, Farmers Empowerment and Protection Agreement on Price Assurance and Farm Service Ordinance, a longish name. It basically tries to promote contract farming, or it at least eases the restrictions on contract farming. So as we just saw that a farmer cannot directly sell his produce to consumers or to food processing companies, it has to go through a licensed trader. Now these kind of restrictions have been reduced. Let's say I am a tomato ketchup making company and I have to procure some special breed of tomatoes, quality of tomatoes. I cannot ask the farmer to get it for me or produce it for me. I have to go through a licensed trader. So those kind of restrictions have been reduced. And this is also something which is possibly going to reduce the number of intermediaries that we have. It can increase competition and it can probably create a national market.
This is again a very interesting thing. Firstly, what they clearly say in the ordinance is that this particular ordinance will override all state APMC laws. And that is a very, very important thing. It's actually buried somewhere there, but it's probably one of the most important things, because each state will have its own set of APMC laws. And these will be in conflict as of now with this particular ordinance. So therefore, it's nice that they've clearly mentioned that this ordinance will override state laws. So what will this do? As Sarthak said, it basically, a farmer can get into an agreement even before the start of production with a sponsor. And this sponsor can be, individuals, they can be partnership firms, they can be big companies, they can be limited liability groups or societies, etc., etc. So, for me, again, I think one of the interesting things, Sarthak, here is, again, the role of the aggregator. So what I'm really hoping for is that they will develop a big, market where aggregators can come in. Because essentially, you remember, one of the big problems is that you have, again, small holdings, right? the farm sizes are too small, so each one of them is uneconomic on its own. But with an aggregator, I think there's potentially some of these things can be changed, where an aggregator will get into different kind of contracts with small farms, and then will put them all together and then sell it as one to a, let's say, a big, as you said, a tomato ketchup manufacturing company. So I think that's where potentially there can again be a development of a new market, which will be beneficial to all parties involved.
Yes. And see, it's not that contract farming has not been considered by governments in the past. In fact, some state governments have had separate legislations to promote contract farming, had come up with a model law to govern contract farming. But all these laws were very, very prescriptive. They used to notify these are the commodities under which you can have contract farming. They also used to prescribe the prices. And again, all the contracts had to be registered with some district authority. So there were a lot of restrictions on that.
Yeah, that's right. And as you said, there are some success stories. Tamil Nadu is one of them, by the way, in the way that they went about the contract farming laws, etc. But these were just too far and too few in between. And what would work in one state or even one district may not work everywhere else, etc. So I think, to have a overall kind of ordinance, and then, when it's passed into a law, which will allow farmers to get into contracts without some of these, overhanging prescriptions from the state government, etc., will, I think, be again beneficial to the parties involved.
Yes.
And now let's go into the third and I think my favorite of them all, which is the Essential Commodities Act.
Yeah, you keep on talking about it a lot.
Yeah, but this is one particular act which always gets on my nerves, the Essential Commodities Act. And this is not only to do with agriculture, of course, but of course agricultural products are prime target for this particular act. So Essential Commodities Act is a type of emergency or a wartime sort of act which the government can use in order to allow or disallow for the sale and production, for the production and sale and distribution of certain commodities. So you have this thing called Essential Commodities Act, under which there are a whole bunch of commodities which the government will say that these are essential for national security purpose or just for the economy, and therefore we dictate who can produce it, where can they sell it, how much can they sell, who can they sell to, and at what price. So essentially, it is going back to the form of command and control economy that India has seen over the years, and we found that excessive governments at the union level were loath to give this one particular power up. And of course, we know that the prime target for all of this has been one particular commodity, which is onions. Onions come and go out of this particular list of essential commodities every other day. When price of onions starts inching upwards, instead of actually allowing the farmers to benefit from the price increase, and therefore will also, send the signal to other farmers to produce more of a particular commodity. Every time the prices started going up, we know how onions are, extremely sensitive in the political climate of India. But, they've made in the cliche is that onions can make or break a government. So the government would take extreme precautions against price increases of onions. They would bring it under the Essential Commodities Act, which also would, by the way, and very importantly, which would also stop the export of these particular goods. It would also, the Essential Commodities Act will prevent farmers or anyone, traders, from exporting a particular good. So even if you have, let's say, the price of onions in India is 40 rupees a kilo, and let's say in Bangladesh it's 80 rupees a kilo, you still couldn't sell there, even though you get double the price. Essential Commodities Act would put stock limits on a whole bunch of these commodities. So essentially, this was done to check this thing called hoarding, right? And therefore control for the price rise of these commodities. So even if there was excess supply, if a particular commodity was under the Essential Commodities Act, your traders couldn't buy them and put them in the warehouse until the supply in the market would go down, and therefore it would make sense to sell it. You were forced to sell at even extremely low prices, which would lead to the things that we've seen of farmers coming out in the open, just destroying crops instead of selling it at such low prices, right? So the Essential Commodities Act is an archaic act, which it probably made sense for the first 5 years after independence, when we didn't have food security, and food security was a big deal. So at that point of time, it probably made sense to say that, food crops, etc., that we were producing has to first feed the millions of people in dire poverty. We no longer are in that situation. We produce excess of every single grain, and it actually rots in warehouses, etc., etc. And part of that is that farmers don't have this freedom to sell. They produce wherever they want, to whoever they want, and whatever time they want. So finally, yes, this particular the reform to the Essential Commodities Act will deregulate various agricultural commodities from cereals, pulses, oil seeds, edible oils, onions, potatoes, all of these things from your stock limits, from the export bans, from the hoarding restrictions, etc. So finally, there's freedom in all of this.
Yeah, exactly. So what they have done is they have defined what are the circumstances under which you can possibly impose this stockpiling limits, stock limits. So only under some extraordinary circumstances. And again, it should not be discretionary. It has to be on the basis of certain increases in price levels. I mean, for vegetables, let's say it's 100%. For cereals, it is 50%. So those kind of objective limits have been set. And also the stock limits cannot be less than what an intermediary deals during normal periods of activity. So, as you mentioned, this is something which is going to reduce the interference of the government into foodstuff market. It is also going to probably ensure smooth conduct of business. Also, one thing, all these stock limits that we have had, this has also been a disincentive, or it has discouraged private sector from investing in storage capacities. We do not have proper warehousing infrastructure. And since we have all these limits, the private sector has also to some extent been discouraged from investing in creating the warehousing facilities and storage facilities. And it impacts, as you said, both farmers as well as the consumers. Whenever you have excess produce, the farmers have to sell it. They don't get the right prices. And again, whenever there is shortage, the consumers have to pay a much larger price for it.
Absolutely, Sarthak. So this is okay. I'm going to borrow words from actually the agriculture minister himself, and so he had said that the entire lack of investment in the agricultural sector, especially in the warehousing and cold storage, etc., was the lack of investment was because of the dampened entrepreneurial spirit, because of the hanging sword of the Essential Commodities Act. Now, I thought it was eloquent, but the two or three things that essentially happen. One, the price signals are all lies when you have something like the Essential Commodities Act, because the government doesn't allow the price mechanism to work in its natural sense, which would give the right kind of incentives to farmers and everyone else in between as well. So that doesn't act as an incentive. So if the price of something is going up, now you would normally see a lot of people would, start producing that. But if, there's something like the Essential Commodities Act, which will stop the price rise and which will, essentially not even allow you to store things and wait for the correct price, then, you will not see investment in any of these things. And again, there's this whole, something that I, detest and I've been ranting about for a very long time. The concept of hoarding is always seen as an extreme. I mean, it comes with extremely negative connotations in India, because it's always seen as, something that only big evil businesses do, right? But it's actually not. I mean, hoarding is essentially what will smoothen supply. Right? If there is excess supply and therefore prices are crashing, then what you would want people to do is to actually hoard, that is, stockpile these things until prices rise and then sell it, right? So you want that smoothing function to occur because of people who have who hoard. And how can you hoard? When you have good warehousing facilities, when you have cold storage facilities, right? So when we say warehousing, it's seen as a good thing, but when you say hoarding, which is essentially stocking it until a later time, is always seen as a bad thing. So I think these things have to change. These are, again, if you allow for the market to function correctly, then chances are that the supply chains will automatically fix themselves, and there's better price stability and for the farmers, which essentially means that they can also plan ahead, right? So these are some of the things that I think the particular removal of the worst or deregulation of the Essential Commodities Act will actually do. But I will always say that it's not enough.
Yeah, so exactly. I was going to come into this point. At present, we are only easing the restriction on the stock limits. Okay, this is the only change that is happening in the ordinance. The governments can do multiple things if they want to do. So they can impose price controls, they can ban transportation, all these things they have done in the past. I was reading an article by Ila Patnaik. She says that in 1970s, the number of people who could attend a banquet was also controlled by the government.
You're absolutely right. I think if you're throwing even a wedding party, there were restrictions on how many people you could invite so that not too many people come and consume too much food, right? That's the level of control that the government can do. So it's always important to remember that.
Yeah. So again, and in 2014 itself, the West Bengal government asked the traders to sell potatoes at prices below the market price. So again, only stock limits have been eased. There can be other ways if the government wants to intervene. So we need to be wary of that as well.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. I mean, I always would go to the extremes, of course. I mean, which, or many people would view it as extreme, not me, obviously. But I think there's real argument to be made for completely dismantling this thing called the Essential Commodities Act. Firstly, I have trouble with a government deciding what is essential. Two, I don't think we are in a situation which requires this particular thing. Again, it made sense. The Essential Commodities Act was passed in 1955. And you could see how it probably made sense in the first, as I said, probably 10 years of our independence where we didn't have food security and therefore you needed to, ensure that there was food security. But beyond that, at this point of time when we have so much of excess food, and where also, import channels are very easy. So even if there's a shortage, we can easily, import things. It's not that we're going to enter a World War III kind of scenario overnight. And if that happens, if such a situation happens, you can change that law then. You don't need, because the existence of the law will always provide an incentive to governments to try and control things which are completely out of their hand. And then that results in the kind of messes that we have seen, right? So it's essential that we completely throughout the Essential Commodities Act. Having said that, now if you just take all three of them together, I think that these are immense improvements over what has been. We have to ensure that firstly the ordinances are actually passed into laws, which has greater detail and that it's seen through essentially because as we've seen, there's been many false starts in this particular area before. So it's essential that this is not one of those cases. Second, I think state governments can do a lot more than what the union government has done. So each state government has also got intricate set of laws on agriculture from the APMC itself to different aspects of, the production, sale and distribution. So I think state governments can take the lead, in fact, in changing and reforming many of the aspects which have held the agriculture back. And this is the perfect time in terms of the political economy aspect of it. Third, and I think this is equally important, that the government can go from this kind of controlling to a more facilitating aspect. So one of the things that the government can do, in fact, is and again, there have been multiple starts on this, but provide better and higher quality information to farmers. So if you're giving farmers the freedom to sell anywhere, I think it'll also help them to, know the prices in different aspects. So here's where, the power of the government, which has got economies of scale, can actually help in some aspects. And that can also just be the starting point, because I think, again, when you have aggregators and when you have private players set up, especially trading platforms, I think this will automatically happen. So state governments can just facilitate some of these things better. So I think with that, we can conclude today's episode. Thanks a lot, Sarthak, for joining in.
Thanks, Anupam.
And thanks everyone else for listening in. Tune in again tomorrow for the next episode.
If you liked our show, don't forget to check out other interesting podcasts on the IVM network. You can tune into them on the IVM Podcast app, ivmpodcast.com, or wherever you listen to your podcasts. You can also follow IVM on social media. The handle is @IVM Podcasts on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. And hey, if you'd like to dive into Takshashila's research on technology, strategy, and economic affairs, check us out at our Twitter handle @TakshashilaINST or our website takshashila.org.in.
I hope you enjoyed that show. I'd like to thank our sponsors this week, Paytm Money. So it's been a really fun week this week. We've had a great episode with Anand Nilakanthan on Cyrus Says. Anand was one of the writers of Bahubali, and it's done some really fun stuff since that. Ashish Vidyarthi also had a really good episode on his show, Begin the Journey. Please do check that out. You do know Yuddha is back, right? Definitely check it out if you haven't. Yuddha is our show about Indian ancient warfare. It's hosted by Anirudh Kanisetti and Aditya Ramanathan. Really, really great show. You should check that out for sure. And oh yeah, I forgot, Rishikesh was on the network as well. He was on Absolutely Right with Aditi Surana. Do definitely check that out. With that, hope to see you next week.
Namaskar, dear Bandhu. My name is Ashish Vidyarthi. These are truly challenging times, and in these times, we need hope. Do take time to listen to my podcast, Begin the Journey. Available on IVM Podcasts, website, app, or wherever you listen to podcasts. Remember, there is hope because there's one life and we are alive.